Audio for TRS-80 Trash Talk is hosted by CyberEars. When you need a rock-solid platform to host and distribute your podcast or other audio media, head over to cyberears.com. Fast, reliable hosting with unlimited bandwidth. CyberEars is your audio on your terms. Welcome to episode 2 of TRS-80 Trash Talk. This is the show about all things TRS-80, from the original Model 1 released in 1977, all the way up to the Xenix-based business computers like the Tandy 6000. Now in that regard, I want to make a small clarification. I mentioned in the introduction in episode 1 that we will not be covering the color computer because it was already well represented. While it's true that the Coco will not be a focus of the show, I did not want to let you think that we will ignore our colorful little brother. So Coco fans, don't be down. We'll have some information on the show for you as well. In fact, Trash Talker Randy Kindig has a news item about an MC10 related accessory later in the show. So in this episode, we're going to be revisiting a few items we discussed in episode 1. We have a bunch of new news items to discuss, and then the main feature will be an in-depth review of voice synthesizer options on the TRS-80 platform by Peter Bartlett. It's a rich and informative segment that you'll not want to miss. So we'll start off the show with a short and enjoyable piece from a TRS-80 tutorial from back in the day. Enjoy.
So this home accounting program goes into the Radio Shack computer. Okay. Switch on to be in the back. Oh, no. It's on the side. Okay. Flap up. Disc in. Flap down. Now what?
You see the orange button? Press that.
Orange button. Oh, there we are. Well, what's all this?
It's not really meant to be read. It's just copyright information. The accounting program is coming up in a moment. Now, type in the date and the time.
Why do we need that?
Because it helps you keep track of when you use certain programs.
Oh, okay. And then press return?
Actually, on the Radio Shack, you press a key mark to enter, but it's the same.
Oh, here it is.
Now type the time.
Okay. Enter. Here we go. Home accounting system. 1, personal budget. 2, balance bank account. 3, mortgage amortization. That's what I'll try. Okay, let's type 3. Enter. Amount of mortgage. $40,000. Interest rate, 16%. Years amortized, 15. Term in years, 10 years. Enter. I definitely have to ask for that raise. That's amazing. It all comes up so fast.
You could argue that all this could be done with a calculator or even with paper and pencil, but you'd never get all those figures to come up so fast. In a way, we're now touching on the secret of the computer's power. Its speed.
Okay, so today we have a full boatload of trash talkers here. We have Mr. Randy Kindig. Hi, Randy.
Hello.
And we have Ian Mavric from Down Under. Hey, Ian.
Hey, how do you do?
And you know him as the developer of the MISE and the soon-to-be officially named M3SE, Mr. Peter Bartlett. Hey, Pete.
Hey, Pete.
So we want to start with some feedback and updates from our first episode. So we've gotten a very positive response to the first episode. Really happy with that. I want to thank you, everybody, for your kind words and your feedback. And it only means that we'll probably be producing, many more episodes going forward. We'll be producing probably one a month or so. Maybe we'll have a few special edition podcasts for interviews and that sort of thing coming in. But just want to let you know, we'll have some interesting segments and interviews coming up soon. And thank you again for all your support. In the first episode, we talked about the Debug software, and we were questioning what's the difference between T-Bug and Debug. Well, we got some feedback from a listener, GP2000 from the VCF, the Vintage Computer Forums, and he basically let us know that Debug is, it's another cassette version of the debugging software. It's basically an updated version of T-Bug with a few additional features. So I'm glad we could clear that up. We also talked about the Pilot Plus software that was on eBay that Ira was selling in order to support his TRS80.com website. And I mentioned how much I appreciated the aesthetics of the binder, so I went ahead and I did purchase it. And I'm going to have a discussion of that either later in this show or in a future episode. There was one item on the Model 1 history I just wanted to elaborate upon. Recently, I've been reading some parts of the book Tandy's Money Machine from 1992 by Irvin Farman. If you ever get a chance to take a read of that book, it's really interesting. Charles Tandy was quite an amazing man. The energy that he had to push his company forward was quite amazing. And how it relates...
I got that book. I bought it when I first started eBaying. I bought it because it was very difficult or not actually ever released in Australia. So as soon as I saw it up for sale, I thought I've got to have that and have a read of that. It's been a good decade since I've had a look at it, but it does have some interesting stuff about the computer days before Charles passed.
Yeah, and go ahead, Randy.
I was just going to say, I've never heard of this book. I'm going to have to look it up and perhaps get a copy. So is a history of Tandy in particular, or history of their computers, or what exactly does this cover?
It's about Charles Tandy's time from the time that he bought Radio Shack, I believe, because remember it used to be a leather goods concern, and so it follows the time from Charles Tandy buying Radio Shack, and so their electronics enterprises through his life up until the time he died. So it's not in any way technical or anything like that, or even full of numbers and sales figures or anything like that. But it is a very interesting read, and with the problems Radio Shack are having these days, the name's kind of slightly ironic. It's not a money machine for them anymore, but they certainly, for a long time there, they had quite a marketplace.
Yeah, and what interested me when I was reading it, because it was related to what we had talked about in the first episode about, we all know the story about how the Model 1 used a repurposed TV set as the monitor, and how they took the color, which was the Mercedes Silver, and applied that to the computer. Well, it wasn't just the color, it was the entire visual design of that TV set. It was the shape, even the vent holes, the way they were cut on the monitor. All of that influenced, the complete design of the Model 1 computer, as well as the expansion interface. And that was just fascinating to me, because before I thought it was just the color, but no, it's the entire design of the monitor was used.
Yeah, when you look close at them, you can see that they took a styling cue, which was that vent along the front of the bottom of the monitor, and they used that on the keyboard unit and the expansion interface. If you have a lot of the computers apart, like I do at any given time, you can see that the base of the plastic base of the Model 1 and the plastic base of the expansion interface are actually the same part, just turned around the other way. A lot of people didn't sort of realise that. I noticed that when I put a computer together once, and I noticed that suddenly the serial number and part thing was missing, because on the expansion interface it's on the top and there's nothing underneath. So that was one of the ways they saved money. But then I looked at all their early computers, like the Model 3 and the Color computer, and they copied the same vent design as well on those computers. And I figure it's a case of, if you design something once and good marketing practice is that if people are accepting a design, then you stick with it to sort of breed to grow the public perception of what a Radio Shack computer looks like. Obviously, eventually they said, we got to change our computers to white because everybody else was, which is the only reason I can think of why they changed them to white. But looking at all the early machines, you can see a lot of styling cues copied from one machine to the other. I think I read in that book, the Tandy Money Machine, about the colour of the monitor. RCA offered them to Tandy either in wood grain or they would paint them silver for free. It was part of the deal, and I believe that Radio Shack at the time just sort of said, we'll go with the silver just because we don't want a wooden look for something as high tech as a computer. Don could probably confirm that easily enough, but I'm pretty sure that's what it was. RCA offered to paint them silver for free.
I've had my Model 1 keyboard and expansion interface taken apart, or I have taken them apart multiple times over the years, and I never realized it was the same bottom plastic piece. That's actually surprising to me.
Yeah, it is. If you have a look, there's the cutout for the power connections on the keyboard unit. Turn it around 180 degrees. It matches the cutout in the bottom where the interconnect cable plugs in.
Yeah, I'm looking at it. I'm looking at it now, and I can see it plain as day. But it never dawned on.
So they could have made all the connection ports the same size, the apertures in the box, but it's bigger on the keyboard on the interconnect one, only because it meant they didn't have to make a different base for the expansion interface. You could just roll off another 100,000 of the same bottom bit rather than redesign it.
That's Charles Tandy for you.
Learn something new every day.
Randy, you want to take a few items you have here?
Yeah. We also talked about the Debug Software in the last episode a little bit, and you mentioned that we had gotten an email about it, actually. I was disappointed to find that I didn't purchase it before it actually expired. So I was really surprised when a few days later it showed up in the mail at my home. Actually, I wasn't that surprised. Ira sent me an email and asked me what my address was, so I knew something was going on. So I went out to his site and I made a donation to basically cover the cost of the software and the shipping and all that. But I now have a copy of the Debug Software in my hands, and I'll be reviewing that either later in the show or in another show. Also wanted to mention that we got contact from Don French again after our last episode. He actually offered to come on the show and elaborate a little more about some of the history on the Model 1. So we are planning on getting him on one of the future shows and discuss some of the things maybe we didn't quite talk about correctly, or he wants to at least clear up a few questions that we had as we were going through the history. So we appreciate Don doing that, and it'll be good to talk to him.
Well, if anybody's qualified to correct us, it would be Don French.
It would be Don, sure would.
And finally, we have the big TRS-80 question of the month is, Pete, how do you pronounce the M3SE?
All right, well, I guess the answer is that you can pronounce it however you want. However, when I originally came up with the name, I wanted it to look a lot like MISE, because obviously the device is a lot like MISE. And for several years, up until maybe 10 years ago, I ran I'm not sure exactly what the acronym stands for, a MUD, a multi-user dungeon, multi-user domain sort of text multiplayer online game. And I ran that for quite a few years, and I had encountered people on the sort of chat lines on that game starting to turn letters backwards and things, and pronouncing a 3 as if it were an E. I sort of took that cue and called it the MISE, because it's a word you could pronounce instead of saying Model 3 or M3SE or whatever you want to call it. Did some research over the last couple of days since the subject came out, and I guess there's a whole sort of hacker phenomenon where they use this language called LEET, which is 733. I forget exactly, 7337 or something that looks like the word LEET with numbers instead of letters. So it's a real thing. So I don't think I'm too far out in left field calling it MISE, although most of us are kind of too old to use those sort of abbreviations and modifications to spelling. I kind of thought it was cute at the time, but the more and more I hear myself pronounce it, the less and less I'm liking it. So I guess the bottom line is you can pronounce it however you want. And in my demo video, I think I pretty universally call it the Mies. And I will probably continue to do so until the day I die, but I'm not going to get upset.
So we can call it what we like. I'll keep calling it the Messy.
Messy.
Oh no, no, that never occurred to me. Oh boy.
Interesting thing about LEET. I mean, you can edit this out if you want, but I work with a lot of young people. The benefit of being rather older than them is that I know what the term LEET means. They all use and speak and write or they write in LEET all the time. But they don't know that what they were using was called LEET. And then when I said to them that I was sick of them writing me emails in LEET, they all sort of, this is people 20 years younger than me, sort of say, we don't know what you're talking about. What is LEET? And then they looked it up and worked it out and haven't sent me a protracted email, punctuated with LEET that I have to do mind gymnastics in order to read.
Yeah, well, hopefully I won't have to discontinue it just because you just called it the Messy. Not sure I can live with that, but Mies or M3SE are equally acceptable.
Okay,
I'm going to try to start calling it the Mies, but I'm not sure if I can.
I like that.
I'm not sure it actually means anything as a word.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure why it sounds so funny, but apparently it does.
Great. Okay. So let's move forward on to the news items we have for this episode. The first one I just want to briefly talk about is there's a new TRS8-Bit Newsletter available from Dusty over in the UK. I'm not even sure I know. Ian, do you know Dusty's last name?
Miller. Dusty
Miller. Okay. So
and I don't think Dusty's his first name. I think it's I think that's just a pseudonym. Prepare to be corrected on that one, but
sure.
But in Australia anyway, Dusty is a very popular nickname for people who work in the outback. So I don't know. I know the UK doesn't have much of an outback or dust, so I'm not sure. It could be his name, but yeah, I just call him Dusty Miller.
Okay, everybody knows him as Dusty in the TRS-80 world, but if you're not familiar with TRS-8-Bit, it's a throwback old school newsletter that he puts together. I think it is about quarterly, and he aggregates all the TRS-80 information he can find. A lot of people write articles. I know, Mav, you participate quite a bit with TRS-8-Bit.
Yeah. About 4 or 5 years ago, I was looking at it and reading some old issues, and they were sort of struggling around the 25 to 30 page mark, and they were interesting, and he was including a lot of and still does include a lot of old advertisements which are just for curiosity value. And that was around the time that I was starting to sort of ramp up my business a bit, and I thought, well, this is just the sort of thing I need, because we don't have 80 Micro or Computer News 80 anymore. So I like writing stuff for it, though at times I sort of get very close to the deadlines and in the old traditional way of requiring something in by a deadline, whereas something like a podcast like this, I can just sort of talk and make it up as I go along. But so since I've sort of joined the place, I've managed to get a few other people to contribute articles. Now we're up averaging about 60 pages an issue, and probably 40 pages of that comprises of new material and things that you can actually buy now. So a lot of people I know are look forward to each issue of TRS8-Bit.
Yeah, just has a nice vintage feel, like you're reading an old newsletter from back in the day. I really enjoy it. Next item of news is regarding the Vintage Computer Forum. So everybody who's involved in the vintage computing scene knows about Eric Klein's VCF Forum, and it's recently come under new management from the VCF organization, the Vintage Computer Federation, that's led by Evan Koblenz, which was formed last year from a melding of a few organizations, including the Mid-Atlantic Retro Computing Group and some others. And they run several of the vintage computing festivals like the VCF East and the Midwest, and I believe the West as well. And I think they're also affiliated with the VCF Southeast. So it's under the new management. The Tandy section of that forum is probably the best place right now on the internet to get help regarding your TRS-80. I know Ian's quite extensively goes on that section, and a lot of TRS-80 experts are, if you're new to the TRS-80 world and you're trying to figure out how to get that Model 1 working, I think it's the best place to go, and you'll get a lot of friendly help when you're there. Just so happens that I have recently become a moderator of the forum, so watch what you say. No, just kidding. I'll take care of you. Everybody's really helpful, and I've never seen, at least in the Tandy forum, I've been there, on that forum for about a year fairly actively, and I don't think I've ever seen a single act of moderation being required. So it's really a well-behaved group of guys.
Well, what I really need on that forum is a way to change my Mayor McCheese avatar to something a little more dignified.
Yeah, I don't think it's that complicated to do, Pete.
I know.
I actually enjoy it, so.
Yeah, I wanted to remind everybody of the upcoming shows. There's 3 in April that will be here very quickly. And I always like to, I know I talk about this on all the podcasts I'm on, but I like to encourage people to go to these things. So the first one up is VCF Southeast in Roswell, Georgia on April 2nd and 3rd. So I've got my display registered. And on the last show, Pete talked me into taking my TRS-80 Model 1 with my MISE and my Model 4P with a Fred and a high-res board. That's what my display is going to be there this year. So
awesome.
Should be fun. Also on April 15th through the 17th in Wall, New Jersey will be VCF East. Pete, you're planning on being there, right?
I'm going to be there, like we mentioned in the first episode, running a couple of TRS-80s with TRS-Box and TRSWiki, and my 12-year-old son will be joining me, so that'll be interesting.
And then in the last weekend, I guess not the last weekend, but April 22nd and 23rd in Lombard, Illinois will be the last Chicago Cocoa Fest, which is obviously geared specifically towards the Cocoa, but it is a TRS-80 computer, so you're likely to see other computers there as well. I did go 1 year to this. It's a fun event, and I really think I'm going to be able to get there again this year. I'm going to try.
Did you say it's the last one?
Well, they call it the last one every year. This is actually the 25th last Chicago Cocoa Fest.
Okay, all right.
So I don't think it's I don't think it's imminent to actually be the last one, but it's kind of a funny name that stuck because each year they didn't know if we're going to be able to do the next one or not. So
it's like the last Rolling Stones tour.
Yeah. Something like that.
Okay.
So if they can have a festival just for the cocoa, it leads me to think, why can't we have some sort of an event for our TRS-80s?
Sure could.
It could, right?
Sure could. I think you should organize one.
Somebody should.
I think I hear a volunteer.
Yeah.
Everybody else step back. Is that what happened?
Yeah.
Pretty much.
The first one to mention it gets to put it together. That's the way it always works.
Well, we'll see. Well, you never know what the future will hold. Only if Mav will fly to the U.S.
I'm sure we can put a Patreon account or something together to make that happen.
Sure, I'd donate to that. Okay, well, I wanted to mention another news item I came across as well, and I don't know how many people saw this. Jim McGinley, who is at bigpants.com or bigpants.ca, I think is the site. I don't know where that name came from. I don't know what the story is behind that. But anyway, he was one of the original founders or co-founders of the Hand-Eye Society and of the Toronto Game Jam. And he recently gave a talk. It was a draft of his talk that he's going to give at the GDC. It's called Emptying the Trash, a last look at TRS-80 game designs. So he gave this talk on February 23rd at a meeting of the Hand-Eye Society in Toronto. It looks pretty interesting. And actually is a follow-up or a sequel to another presentation he gave at GDC 2012, which was called Inspiration from the Trash. And
yeah, I've seen that talk. It's on YouTube, or it was at the time.
yeah, so I'm not sure. I didn't write down here when that GDC is, but he's basically talking about 15 or more of the best games for the TRS-80 computer, and he actually will show you. It says videos will be shown of each game being played at a high level by the presenter, one of the few people alive who's skilled at these games. So if you're interested in games on the TRS-80, there you go.
We'll have to check that out, yeah. Ian, you want to talk about the SUPERMEM?
Yeah, it's an interesting device. Pascal from France has been for quite a few years now been interested in reverse engineering old TRS-80 hardware so that it can be appreciated by future generations. And a lot of the stuff that, particularly that was limited in production, interests him. And, well, basically he was just reverse engineered the old Alpha Products 512K memory upgrade for the Model 1, which was originally sold by Alpha Products, I believe, then sold by Anatech, who were the people that used or that sold LeScript. I bought one in 1987 from Anatech because at the time I was using LeScript for everything. I had my Model 1 at home and my Model 4 at university, and LeScript was my chosen word processor. So in an early version of sort of data transportability, I'd have my 128K Model 4 at uni and my Model 1 at home, and I'd just pack my discs in my bag each day and take them to and fro and work on things. And those of you who have been through university know that the documents you type get bigger and bigger, and they were great on the Model 4, but we're soon running out of memory space on the Model 1 with its 48K memory. As LeScript got better, the amount of buffer space you've got to type things became really restrictive. And so I ordered and fitted one of these memory upgrades. And then I was talking to Pascal as best I could. He doesn't speak much English and I speak no French, so it's all done through Google Translate, it's amusing some of the times with what it translates to, but we've pretty much worked out its little quirks. And I said, this one will be interesting because it comprises of two PAL chips on it, and if you know how a PAL chip works, it can be difficult to deduce what's in it if you don't know the computations that are required while programming it. Though he was saying that him and his friend, I think it's pronounced Reggie Munoz, also from Europe, have had good success with reverse engineering PAL chips, getting the information out of them and reapplying it to GAL chips, GAL chips. And so I removed the device, sent it to Pascal. After a couple of weeks of work, came back to me and said it's a success. He's managed to copy it. The one thing he didn't like about it was that the original design, as it was in the 80s, required you to cut a post inside the Model 1 case. So, and this was pretty standard at the time. If things didn't fit, they just the developers of the hardware just said cut this post and it will fit. But we've got sort of better software these days for designing circuit boards, and so Pascal changed the layout of the chips slightly so we can have a big hole in the middle of the SUPERMEM. It allows you to fit it into a Model 1 without cutting any of the plastic of the case. So that was one of the improvements he did to it. So I received in the mail last week my original SUPERMEM and his reverse engineered one, and I've tried it out. It's working pretty well.
So what is this going to let me do with my Model 1?
What it does is it gives you X number of banks. Yeah, I forget how big the banks are, whether they're 32, 48, or 64K, and it allows you to bank switch between them. It's compatible because the Anatech company, you may recall from their old adverts, they sold memory upgrades for the Model 3 and 4 ranging from sort of 768K to 1 meg to 4 and to 8 meg. So this is compatible with that system on those machines. So their print spooling and memdisk software also works with the SUPERMEM, as well as all later versions of LeScript past version 1.70, I think. So yeah, so it was one of those things that it probably didn't sell in really large numbers because people had to sort of see the use for the thing. Though if you were like me and you're word processing enormous documents, that 480K storage buffer was really handy.
So is there any software like word processing software that actually will take advantage of it?
Yeah, LeScript takes advantage of it automatically. It just knows it's there and
LeScript, you say?
Yeah, LeScript.
LeScript, okay.
Yeah, that was one of the sort of the three major word processors of the 80s and early 90s for the TRS-80. I think for people that were serious word processors, they had the choice of LeScript, AllWrite, and probably Tandy's Superscripts. I tried all of them, and I liked LeScript the best because it had good handling and easy programming of, italics and special characters and bold and underline. And I was doing a lot of scientific sort of papers at the time, so something that allows me to do scientific notation worked really well for me.
I assume you could probably use some of that memory as a RAM disk as well if you wanted to. Is that true?
Yeah, they make I've tried it with the RAM disk software. They did produce a RAM disk. That was one of the memory expansion product's main focuses, actually, was RAM disk, because I think at the time when we're talking about 1986 or 7 through to 1991 or 2, hard disks are still very expensive for a lot of people, and if they can get this, if all they're after is the speed, a RAM disk based system is very, very quick. It's even faster than a hard disk system.
Well, thanks to you and Pascal for keeping these lesser known accessories alive and bringing them back to life. That's pretty awesome.
Yeah, someone asked me if I was going to produce some to sell. I'm in two minds about it at the moment as to how popular or whether there'd be enough interest in it. One of the things when I decide on something to sell, I usually decide if I think that I can sell sort of 10 or 15 of something, then I'll do the work in order to make and sell them. Because it's a small circuit board, similar in size to the CPM mapper, and it goes into the Z80 socket, it sort of can't be used in the same machine as a CPM mapper. Although it adds another hardware option for the Model 1, it also makes it inconvenient. You end up having to have sort of a whole bunch of machines if you want to have every bit of hardware available at your fingertips.
So, Randy, you had an item on the MC10.
Yeah, the MC10, the TRS-80 MC10 doesn't really seem to get much press on any of the podcasts, so I thought I would mention this. There is an add-on device called the MCX128, which has been available for some time, and the news item really was that there was a case being made now available for that, because it's just a bare, when you buy the MCX120, it's just a bare board. And John Strong at Strongware has now made available a case that you can get for it. And but I thought, well, some people may not know what an MCX128 is, so I probably should describe exactly what that is. It actually is a memory expansion for the MC10, and it's designed by Darren Atkinson. It plugs into the expansion port at the rear of the computer and adds 128K of RAM and a ROM socket, which has MCX Basic, which is an extension to Basic for the machine. With this device and with the MCX Basic that's on it, it makes it a much more powerful machine than the stock machine. So if you're interested in getting an MCX10, you can contact Ed Snyder, whose handle is Zipster, and he still has some of those available, and we have the contact information available in the show notes.
So is it a new device, or has it been out for a while?
The MCX 128 actually was designed, I think, quite some time ago, but I think within the last 6 months or so, Ed Snyder actually produced a run of them. So he took the plans and made a run of those and then sold those. So the device has been around for a while, but once in a while, they'll make a run of them. And when you have an opportunity, and if you care at all about the EMC10, it's definitely a device to have for that.
It's nice to see the MC10 getting some love. I think that's the one TRS-80 I don't have. I'm going to have to pick one of those up and start playing around with it a little bit.
Yeah, they're pretty inexpensive to add it to your collection. They don't cost much at all.
Yeah.
And doesn't take up much space.
No, they don't. That's right.
There you go. One other item I wanted to add, I just listened to the latest episode of the Retro Computing Roundtable podcast, and I just wanted to give a thank you to those guys because they had a short review of our podcast, and they were pleasant, and they were very supportive and welcoming us to the podcast community. So just a thank you to the RCR guys.
You've heard or read about low-cost personal computers. Today, you can see and buy the price leader, Radio Shack's famous under $600 system. Learn how computing can benefit your business, profession, record-keeping, and your education. Come into your nearby Radio Shack today. You will be convinced. The TRS-80 personal computer system, only $599, built and serviced by Radio Shack, a Tandy company.
Okay, so next we're going to be discussing a very important and significant TRS-80 accessory. So this will be the first of many, as we promised you, in-depth reviews of the important and significant TRS-80 accessories for the Model 1, the Model 3, and the Model 4. The one we're going to be talking about today is probably one of the most prized accessories you can find for your TRS-80 these days. It's the TRS-80 voice synthesizer box. Peter Bartlett is kind of an expert in that. He has a very good understanding of the technical details and how the system works. So he's going to lead us in a discussion of the history and the operation of the voice synthesizer. Pete?
All right, thanks, Peter. Like you said, I'm going to be talking to you about the Radio Shack voice synthesizer, which was a peripheral add-on for the TRS-80 Model 1. It worked with both Level 1 and Level 2 Basic. The Radio Shack catalog number was 26-1180. And what it did, just like it sounds, it provided audible speech for your TRS-80 Model 1. Radio Shack first started producing these in 1979 and stopped producing them around 1983, which was a couple of years after they stopped producing the Model 1 itself due to FCC regulations. The device originally sold for $399 in 1979, and to the best of my knowledge, they never reduced the price during the production run. So what I'd like to do is talk to you a little bit about what the voice synthesizer was, how it worked, go into a fair amount of technical detail about it, and then I'd like to compare it to a couple other methods that you might have used to get voice on your TRS-80. So what you got with your voice synthesizer was a particle board box, roughly 4 inches high, 12 inches wide, 6 inches deep. Thanks for those measurements, Peter. As we go on, I want you to be aware I don't actually have one of these in front of me. Most of my memories of one of these comes from the days when they were original equipment. And what I've got that I'm going to be using for some demonstrations today is a clone device that I built probably 6 or 8 years ago. But it sounds the same, uses the same voice chip. So what you got was this particle board box, which was painted silver to match the, as has already been mentioned, the Mercedes silver color that Radio Shack either really liked or got for free, apparently is the right answer on their Model 1 monitors, expansion interfaces, and keyboard units. The front panel of it was covered with fabric like a stereo speaker. And in fact, behind the fabric, black-colored fabric, or charcoal gray anyway, was an amplified speaker which provided the voice output. Also on the front panel was a silver knob that turned it on and off and raised and lowered the volume. There was also an LED, I believe it was red in color, labeled Device Select, that was on. I'd like to say it was on while the thing was speaking, which isn't strictly true, and we'll go into that a little later. There was also a Radio Shack nameplate on the front panel. On the rear panel, which was painted black particle board, there was a power jack for an AC to AC adapter, which basically means it was a step-down transformer. And the rectifier and the other components for generating DC voltages, like voltage regulators, were actually inside the box itself. Also coming out of the back of the unit was a 40-pin ribbon cable assembly with a card edge connector on the other end that you'd use to attach to the TRS-80. It was roughly 26 inches long, and most people I knew who had one of these voice synthesizers pretty universally stuck the thing on top of the monitor, so it's good that they provided a reasonably long cable so you could do that. In order to hook it up to your TRS-80, what you would do is take the ribbon cable connector, and if you had a level 1 machine or if you had a level 2 without an expansion interface, you'd hook the 40-pin card edge connector to the expansion card edge connector on the left rear of the keyboard unit. Or if you had a level 2 with an expansion interface, you'd hook the card edge connector to the left side of the expansion interface. A few words about software support for this thing. Very, very limited software support for the voice synthesizer from Radio Shack themselves. And there are actually very good and clever reasons for this, which we'll get into. One program that came with it was a demo that came on a cassette with the unit. And this demo was also run in Radio Shack stores, sort of advertised the availability of the voice synthesizer. And I think that demo probably sold at least as many Model 1s as it did voice synthesizers, because you'd be in the Radio Shack store, you'd hear this demo speaking in sort of a strange voice, you'd see a computer over there, you'd go take a look, and I think more than a few people probably realized, well, there's more to this computer than just playing games. It can actually talk to me. That's pretty neat. Maybe I'll buy one of those. Other than that demo program, the only other program that I know that Radio Shack themselves produced was a talking version of the ELIZA sort of computerized psychotherapist program, which had been around in many various forms since the sort of mainframe days of computing. And what that was is it would say, hello, I'm Eliza, your psychotherapist, or something like that. Tell me your problems. You type in sentences, and it had some very basic capabilities for responding to those. Sometimes it would turn what you said around, like if you say the word you, it would say, we're not talking about me, we're talking about you. Is that the real reason? Is that tell me what's bothering you? And it could turn, you into I, and so forth. It had some very basic capabilities, but the talking version, for reasons that will become obvious, sort of avoided feeding back to you things that you would type to it simply because it had a hard time producing correct words from the way the words are typed in English. Now, the reason I believe that Radio Shack produced such a small library of software for this thing is because they intended that buyers of the voice synthesizer would add voice to their own basic programs, and they made it extremely easy to do that. There were a few third-party applications, nothing really worth mentioning, but I think it was a very clever approach by Radio Shack to make it so easy that even a novice user who knew just a little bit of BASIC could add voice to their basic programs, and a lot of people did that. The way the thing operated was that, I'll back up a second. In the Model 1, Level 1, Level 2, doesn't matter. The screen, the display screen is memory mapped. It has 16 rows of 64 characters each, or a total of 1,024 memory mapped character locations. The voice synthesizer, what it would do is monitor any writes, any characters being written to the last 32 characters out of 64 of the last row. They call this in the user manual that came with the voice synthesizers the window. Anything that was written to the screen went to the voice synthesizer. One thing a lot of people don't realize is that all 32 of those locations actually worked exactly the same as each other. You could write to the same location over and over and over. You could write to a random one of the 32 character locations. They all did exactly the same thing. But the sort of brilliant part about what they did was that in BASIC, in Level 2, you'd have a print at statement where the at is the the @ symbol, such as you'd see in an email address. And in level 1, it was actually the letters AT. You'd say print AT, and then give it a screen location, 0 through 1023, and then a string. And what was contained in this string that you would send to the voice synthesizer were printable keyboard characters. And what they represented were phonemes, which are vowel and consonant sounds that you could string together to make words, any words you wanted, because it included pretty much every phoneme from the English language. In the user manual, there's a list of the phonemes and exactly what keyboard characters they corresponded to. So you could string these together, write a string, print @ it turned out the address was 992, was the first of those last 32 memory addresses that corresponded to the display memory. You could print the list of phonemes to that memory that display address, and it would speak exactly what you told it to speak. The user manual also had a very, very handy dictionary, very lengthy dictionary of a lot of English words and their translations into phonemes for the voice synthesizer. Each of these phonemes was roughly 447 to 250 milliseconds in duration. Some of them were not strictly speaking phonemes. Some of them were variable length pauses. But the important point was that that Radio Shack went to great effort to map these onto characters that you could type into your keyboard into the string to print to the screen, which made it, as I said, simple for even a novice to add voice to their programs. Now, before you could actually get it to speak, since a lot of programs not intending to use the voice synthesizer obviously printed things to those last 32 characters of screen memory, what you would do is use a special character, which was the question mark, to do what Radio Shack called opening the window, which means start listening for phonemes. And once you were done printing phonemes to the screen, you'd issue another question mark to that region, which would mean stop listening for phonemes. And in fact, the first question mark would turn on the red LED on the front of the voice synthesizer, which was labeled device select, I believe, and the second question mark would turn it off. Now, the voice synthesizer had a buffer, a FIFO that was 32 characters deep, which corresponds very nicely to the 32 character width of the window. But the LED didn't necessarily correspond to when it was speaking. It just corresponded to when you were writing phonemes into the buffer. So you could print a question mark, print 32 phonemes, print another question mark, and the red light on the front of the voice synthesizer would just flash on and flash off after a fraction of a second. Although this approach made it very easy for novices to add voice to their basic programs, there were a few problems with it. The first one being that, as I said, this window is in screen memory, so when you printed your phonemes to the screen, they appeared visually on the screen and generally looked like garbage. The second problem was that if you, say, listed a basic program that happened to scroll a question mark, which is the open window character, through that region of the screen, and then other characters in your basic program were listing through that region, you would basically get babbling or jabbering until a second question mark happened to come along and shut the thing up, if it ever did. If it didn't, it would just go on jabbering for a long, long time, and some of the phonemes are indefinite length. So if it ended with one of those, there's generally vowel sounds. It would just maddeningly keep pronouncing the same sound ad infinitum. A third problem was that with this approach was that there was no feedback to your basic program. You couldn't tell from the voice synthesizer how much room was left in the buffer for perhaps more phonemes if you're wanting to pronounce a longer sentence or multiple sentences. You couldn't tell whether it was ready, whether the voice synthesizer chip itself was ready for another phoneme. There was no feedback like that. So what you ended up having to do was use 4 next loops, which are generally just wasting time until you knew that there was enough space for the additional phonemes that you wanted to print. And this worked reasonably well when it was just a cassette-based system, but when people started using these with disk-based systems, there are interrupts that are happening all the time, and they perform various tasks like updating real-time clock calendars and other things like that are, and user programs can set up their own interrupt routines. You never really know how long an interrupt is going to take. So a simple 4 next loop can actually vary quite a bit in how much time it actually wasted. So you could end up having phonemes sent to the thing too early, too late. It was kind of unpredictable. One thing Radio Shack did with this demo program that I've mentioned, which is actually kind of clever, is that the Model 1 has a double width character mode, which instead of 16 rows of 64 columns, you put it in this mode and you get 16 rows of 32 columns, where it only prints every other column in the screen memory double wide. So there are 32 columns in that row. Every other column doesn't actually appear on the screen if you write to it. And so what they cleverly did in this voice synthesizer demonstration program was wrote only the ones that didn't appear on the screen, the locations that didn't appear on the screen but yet went to the voice synthesizer. There were 16 such locations, so that when they were running this demo in the Radio Shack store, people didn't ask inconvenient questions like, what is all this garbage appearing in the lower right hand of the screen while it's speaking? Which I doubt a lot of the store managers would have been prepared to answer. So while we're on the voice synthesizer demo, I'd like to play you a sample of that. And Peter will have to do some cutting to cover the transitions, but here we go.
Hello, this is a TRS-80 voice synthesizer demonstration program. I can be programmed to speak any words by using phonemes. For example, the phonemes in the word hello are hello. Hello. The phonemes in the word compute are compute.
And it continues from there. If you hung around your local Radio Shack store in the late 1970s and early 1980s, there's a good chance you've heard that demo.
It has that classic, 1970s computer voice that you always think of.
Yeah, it does. To my ear, it sounds very robotic. Mm-hmm. I actually had a sort of a argument with somebody on a forum several years ago about how that voice sounded. I thought it sounded too German. And the person I was arguing with German and said he didn't want one of these because it sounded too American. So I'll leave it up to the individual listener to decide which it really is. It's probably somewhere in between the two points of view. So next I'd like to go into some of the details of the implementation of the voice synthesizer. At the heart of it was a chip called the SC01A from Votrax, which, believe it or not, was originally the vocal division of the Federal Screw Works in Detroit, Michigan. There's a sort of a strange array of businesses for one company to be in. There was an SC01 chip originally that didn't really catch on. Votrax made a few modifications to its internal ROM, which controlled exactly how it sounded while it was speaking, came out with the SC01A, which really caught on quite well. It was used in a lot of different applications. Eventually, they came out with a new version called the SC02, which my understanding is had much better speech, but really didn't catch on nearly as much as the SC01A. The SC02, I believe, was used in something called the Commodore 64 Votalker and a few other devices, but the SC01A was really the sweet spot for Votrax. Votrax themselves came up with a unit called the Type and Talk, using the SC01A, and what this was, it was essentially a voice synthesizer that used RS-232, so you could hook it to any computer that used RS-232, a PC or what have you, and essentially had yourself a voice synthesizer. A lot of arcade games used the SC01A. For instance, Q*bert's voice was an SC01A. Let's see, the main competition for the SC01A, there was a chip called the General Instruments SPO256-AL2. I'm not aware of a lot of devices that it went into. TI was very big in the space. One of their chips called the TMCO280, later called the TMS5100, was in a device called the Speak and Spell, which was kind of a children's toy, which had a sort of a little chiclet keyboard and an LED display that could display letters, the full alphabet, and it had a number of games and spelling quizzes and things like that, and add-on cartridges for math and various other things. Now, the problem I have with that device came out in 1978 and lasted, I think, into the 90s in various forms. The problem I had with that is you've just heard the voice synthesizer demo, and the TI chip sounded much like it, not exactly like it, but much like it. But if you were a parent back in the late 1970s or early 1980s and you wanted your child to learn English pronunciation from one of these chips, then I guess I call into question your parenting abilities, or
TI
just
had
an observation.
TI had, I guess, arguably the best voice synthesizer integration with a home computer with the TI-99/4A, right?
Yeah. Their chips were quite popular, as popular, if not more so, than the Votrax chip. To my ear, they sounded a little bit better, a little bit less robotic, but still not something you want your kids to use for an example. Let's see, the output of the SC01A chip that was used in the voice synthesizer was unamplified, so you sort of had to add your own amplifier and volume control and all of that. Its input was a 6-bit phoneme code, which comes to 64 total phonemes that you could program into the thing. And in the Votrax SC01A manual, which we'll try and get into the show notes, a link to that, there's a list of all 64 of the phonemes. Some of them are pauses of various length. One of them is stop speaking, and some other control functions. Another input was a 2-bit inflection, which essentially pitched the voice higher or lower. Radio Shack, for reasons that we'll discuss a little bit more, decided not to use that.
So how do you set the voice synth to ask a question if it doesn't do that inflection?
You really can't.
Okay.
You really can't. And there are other versions of voice synthesizers that did use the inflection, but you really couldn't make the voice rise at the end of a sentence to make it sound like a question. Another reason why I suppose it sounded so robotic. And the reason that they didn't use the inflection was that, as I said, they mapped these 64 phoneme codes, binary codes that the SC01A chip could receive onto printable keyboard characters. And remember that most Model 1s didn't have a lowercase modification. They couldn't count on you being able to enter all 26 lowercase letters. So they were very, very limited in the number of phonemes that they could actually allow the user to program. And multiplying that by 4 for inflection simply wasn't possible. They had to leave out, because of the limit on the number of printable characters, they completely left out 2 of the SC01A phonemes. They were a little bit smart about the way they did that, because the 2 that they completely left out were longer versions of vowel sounds that you could sort of make by just stringing together a couple of the shorter versions. And then there were several other phonemes that you couldn't really produce from the keyboard. You had to use CHR string or some other basic construct or a poke in order to get probably 4 or 5 of the other phonemes. But again, they were longer versions of vowel sounds that you could get shorter versions of and string together. Now, what the voice synthesizer had inside of it was actually a translation ROM, where these characters that you printed to the screen would come into the ROM and as the address, and the output of the ROM would be the actual phoneme code that went into the 32-byte buffer FIFO that was unloaded at the bottom into the SC01A chip. There was some other miscellaneous logic in there, some address decoding, obviously, to decode the screen address, a driver for the device select or window LED to turn it on and off. So the next thing I'll do is play another quick demo here. This is a text-to-speech program. I don't believe it came with the voice synthesizer, but it gives you some idea of the difficulties of translating text-to-speech, and we'll compare and contrast that later with some programs that came with competing devices. Okay, now I've typed in a phrase to this text-to-speech program, and I think most of us will recognize it. Ian might not, it being sort of an American thing, but anyway, here's the phrase. I think you'll recognize it.
Now is T L God Lay to Come to Ed as Care Down 3.
Okay, now obviously that was a Thomas Paine quote, but it had a few problems.
That was the least American thing I've ever heard in my life.
Sounded German, right?
Yeah. It sounded like a German ordering an Australian beer.
Obviously, there were gaps between the words because this program is written entirely in BASIC. Also, time became Tim, country became country, and as I said, the words were very, very clipped. And we'll compare and contrast that to a version that came with a different voice synthesis device a little bit later. The next thing I want to discuss is why there were no Model 3 or Model 4 versions of the voice synthesizer. Radio Shack could have done a voice synthesizer based around the SC01A for those other computers, but it could not have worked the same where you print to the window to get it to speak, and therefore it's very easy for basic programmers because the expansion bus on those computers didn't include a lot of the signals that you would need to decode the fact that the screen memory is being written to, the signals being the most significant byte of the CPU address and the memory read and write signals. Without those, you simply couldn't capture or decode the fact that the window was being written to. Now, they could have done something with an I/O port instead. Why they chose never to do so, I'm not sure. But that's the reason why.
I can speculate that I think that the Model 1 version was an experiment, and that the reason it was in catalogues until 1983 was probably that it took so long to sell the back catalogue of inventory. Probably the licensing to Votrax for the chip cost a lot of money, which is why they never dropped the price of the thing until they got rid of the last ones, and they sort of looked at how many they'd sold and whether there was the interest in there, and if they could have worked out a way to make it work with the Model 3 if they had the idea that they would sell enough units. But I think along with this and its companion product, the VoxBox, were both interesting experiments at the time, but they just didn't get enough traction for them to bother to make them for the later TRS-80 machines.
Yeah, I'm surprised about that speculation because it seems to me back in the late 70s, early 80s, the voice synthesizer was a very, very popular peripheral device. It seems like nearly half the people I knew who had a Model 1 also had the voice synthesizer, even though it was so very expensive. $399 when you could get a level 1 computer for what was $599, I think. It seemed like almost everybody had them. So, if they sold a couple 100,000 Model 1s, it seems like they must have sold at least in the tens of thousands of voice synthesizers.
Maybe, I don't know. Very rare here in Australia. My one was bought at a fire sale when they had a where is as is sale in the early 80s, and just to get rid of the Australian inventory. Not many people I know here own one, and those that do had tended to buy them on eBay and import them themselves. So they do come up with reasonable regularity, probably one every 3 months or so in the US on eBay. So there's probably a few of them around. I reckon a lot of them might have been bought, used a couple of times, and then just put away.
Yeah, it does get old pretty quickly, but the first time you see and hear it, it sure draws your attention. In fact, as we're recording this, there's one on eBay that I noticed today that's going for just over $200. There's already 17 bids on it, and there's 6 or 7 days left to go.
Does it have its smarts inside it?
It's not the empty box we saw a little while ago. Yeah, it actually has photos of the insides.
Okay,
but it's sold as is, so you don't really know what you're getting.
Yeah, I'm looking at it now. It's untested, and that price is going to go up given what they've sold for in the past.
So moving along, I'd like to talk now about some alternatives to the TRS-80 voice synthesizers. The most popular one I know of was the VS100 made by Alpha Products. Now, Alpha Products was really a great seeming company. They're the guys that had all those ads in the very first few pages of 80 Micro magazine. They had pages of hardware ads, bus extenders, clock calendar, joystick, all kinds of great hardware, all kinds of great software. They remarketed a lot of the Big Five games, Galaxy Invasion. They had the Wayne Westmoreland stuff like Arm Patrol. They had things like Defense Command, Frogger, Scarfman. Every time I saw their ads when I opened up 80 Micro, I wanted to buy everything they had. But of course, I was just a kid, so I couldn't. The VS100, they came out with, Alpha Products did in 1983, which coincidentally was the same year that Radio Shack stopped making their voice synthesizer, so there wasn't a whole lot of overlap there. The original price was $69.95 for the VS100, and they lowered it a couple times over its useful life, which in fact ended around 1990 if I've got reliable information. The reason it lasted so long, or one reason, was that they made them not only for the Model 1, but also for the Model 3, the Model 4, and the Coco, so that the last part of their inventory was kept hanging on for Model 4s, which Radio Shack kept selling until roughly that same time. Now, the VS100 didn't come with a speaker, an amplified speaker like the Radio Shack box did, but you could get one from the Alpha Products website for $5.95, so that was no big deal. So the savings was very significant over a voice synthesizer. And in fact, the Coco version, I don't think you even needed a speaker module to use it. In appearance, it was essentially a dongle that hung off of the expansion port. I don't believe it was intended for the level 1 TRS-80. It was sort of a level 2 only thing. It came with a lot more software than the Radio Shack box. There was a voice editor called VS Edit. All of the software that you would load needed a driver loaded into high memory, and that did a lot of the text-to-speech tasks and did them about as well as can be expected for those days. There were a lot of extra third-party software available, and Alpha Products themselves sold additional sort of high-tech text-to-speech programs called Talker. They had several different versions of that, starting from $19.95 up to about $40. Those had built-in dictionaries so that the program didn't have to algorithmically decide how to translate a word into phonemes. The VS100 was also based on the same Votrax SC01A chip, so in that respect it was very similar in sound to the Radio Shack version, but there were some noticeable hardware differences. For one thing, there was no buffer like the 32-byte FIFO in the Radio Shack version, but what you did get was some feedback on the same port, which is port 11 or 0B hex, that you would write your phonemes to. You could also read that and see when the SC01A chip was ready for another phoneme. But in practice, what this essentially meant was that you had to sit there and babysit it, give it a phoneme, sit there and loop and wait for it to be ready for the next phoneme, give it the next one. And you did that by in and out statements in Level 2 Basic, rather than the very simple print at. So it required a slightly more sophisticated user of Basic. It didn't have any sort of translation ROM, because you would give it the direct binary for the SC01A phoneme, so you could produce all 64 phonemes with no problem. And the other 2 bits, 6 bits for the phoneme, the other 2 bits were fed to the inflection port that we talked about earlier of the SC01A, so you could actually make the pitch of the sound go up and down. I don't believe that actually shortened or lengthened any of the phonemes, so it didn't speak more quickly or more slowly, just at a higher or lower pitch. So at this point, I guess I'll play a demo of the VS100 software that came with it. First, I'll do a text-to-speech of the same phrase that we heard earlier from the Radio Shack box, and then I will hit an option that does some sound effects using VS100. The first one you hear is a train. The second one is Morse code. The third one is a siren, which shows very clearly the pitch control. And the last one is supposed to be whispering, so I'll take a moment and cue this up.
Now is the time for all good men to come to the end of their boundary. 5. Toot toot. Synthetic.
That was a better sounding experience than the Radio Shack version to my ear.
Okay, yeah, so as you can see, that the text-to-speech demo obviously was a lot better. The words weren't as clipped. It got most of them right. Obviously, the last one, country, it pronounces country, but using just a built-in driver with no dictionary, that's sort of to be expected. If you expect it to pronounce the word count correctly, then you're going to get country as count, or vice versa. So I think that actually does a pretty good job. The sound effects, you can definitely hear the inflection control on the siren. I think it's making the same vowel sound and just pitching it up and down. So that was the VS100 voice synthesizer from Alpha Products. Another option that was used in software programs for the TRS-80 was sampled audio for the cassette port. There was a series of Talking Adventures, for example, and some arcade games that used this approach. And I'll play one of those for you now called Galaxy Invasion Plus. And this is a game from Big Five Software that I believe was also marketed by Alpha Products. So give a listen to this.
Galaxy Invasion! Player 1!
Okay, so some of the advantages to that approach were obviously you can mix sound effects and speech however you want. You can pitch it higher and lower simply by raising and lowering the sampling rate, the playback rate. The disadvantages are to store that many samples, you need a lot of RAM, and it's not something that the novice can easily just go ahead and do for themselves. Probably need some sort of specialized recording equipment. So I think I've gone over the voice synthesis hardware and a little bit of the software that was available back in the early TRS-80 days. I'd like to just briefly touch on what you might do if you want to build yourself a clone, since the originals, although they pop up from time to time on eBay, are fairly expensive. One thing about a project like this, and I built my clone back in roughly 2010, is that there's really no avoiding the fact that you do need an original SC01A chip. It would be extremely difficult in a major science project to try to reproduce the internals of that chip. I've seen software approaches to trying to emulate that chip for TRS-80 emulators, and they use samples of the phonemes. And the latest one I looked at had some 100 kbytes worth of samples, which isn't very realistic if you're going to create a reproduction device. Really, you need an SC01A chip. They do pop up on eBay from time to time. I believe there's one on there right now, which is roughly $45, so they're not cheap. You need a FIFO chip. I use the chip called the 74HCT7030. This was 6 or 7 years ago. They're probably hard to find now, but there are equivalents. That particular chip had a 64-byte depth. You probably want to make a clone, if you were to build it, compatible with both the Radio Shack device as well as the VS100, which mine is. So you need to listen on port 11, like the VS100, and provide some signals from the SC01A chip that the user can read and see whether the chip's ready for another phoneme. Likewise, you need to have the FIFO, you need to have the translation ROM for Radio Shack type accesses to the screen to produce phonemes. And mine, for all the glue logic, I used a couple of GALs, generic array logic. I think Ian mentioned those earlier. You could do an even better version if you had a CPLD. So I think I've covered just about everything that I wanted to say about the Radio Shack voice synthesizer, and briefly touched on some other voice synthesis methods for the TRS-80. Hopefully there was enough detail and not too many inaccuracies, and also hope that it was informative and brought back to listeners some fond memories of Model 1 voice synthesis.
Okay, thanks Peter Bartlett for that thorough review of voice synthesis options on the TRS-80 platform. So we'd like for you, the listeners, to send us your comments and stories about your experiences regarding voice synthesizers on the TRS-80. We plan to have a further group discussion about Peter B's review in a future episode, and it would be great to include your feedback as well. So that wraps up the show for this episode. Again, thank you all for the support, and we promise to keep on talking about TRS-80s as long as you want us to. Remember to visit us on our Facebook page at TRS-80 Trash Talk, or on Twitter at TRS-80 Trash Talk, or on our website www.TRS80trashtalk.com. Until next time, keep trash talking.